So maybe if I just start with, press this button, yeah. Just in terms of the Child and Family Agency's response, I suppose, to child protection and welfare, and in particular with regard to investigating allegations of child sexual abuse. I suppose the legislative powers that underpins our practice is defined by the Childcare Act 1991. Particularly within the Childcare Act 1991, we pay reference to Section 3, which I suppose states to the Child and Family Agency that we are responsible for ensuring the welfare and protection of children in our communities who are deemed to be in need of care and protection. No pressure. That is supported by the Childcare Amendment Act, and we are given statutory provisions and supported guidance under Children's First National Guidance. We have our Practice Welfare Handbook, which gives our social workers on the ground good guidance and direction in terms of following out our investigations. I suppose maybe just to talk about the referral pathway and the social work department. I know in Donegal we have just recently set up an intake team. In some other parts of in Ireland, I know that there's duty workers attached to social work teams. So I suppose the first point of entry would be into a duty and assessment intake worker. Their purpose is to establish whether there is a reliable child protection concern. They will form an opinion as to whether that assessment needs to go on to be initially screened out. We would look at sourcing information from the guards, important source of information, GP, schools, indeed the parent, and indeed the child. Following that screening process, there will be a decision made as to whether that initial assessment should progress to child protection, whether it should progress to family support, or whether it should indeed close the social work department. The thresholds that we currently are operating under have been devised and utilised from TUSLA, and they're benchmarked against the Hardiker model. We look at level 1 in terms of universal services. We look at level 2 where there's a child who has a need. And indeed the Child Protection and Social Work team will specifically look at level 3 and level 4. High level 3 cases will be aligned with maybe a social work intervention attached with maybe some family support. But most definitely when there's a referral into the social work department that indicates that the child has been abused, it will be responded to as a level 4 child protection investigation. In the event where there has been clear evidence that a child has been sexually abused, what happens? How do we respond at the front entrance to our social work department? We will make contact with Garda Síochána. We will establish whether a crime has been committed. We will form a strategy meeting. We will share concerns. We will agree an interim protection plan. We may need to discuss whether that child can remain within the family home. Is there an immediate risk to that child? Is the abuse intrafamilial? Is the abuse extrafamilial? We will ensure that child is responded to by getting the medical attention that they need. Who is involved? The child. We will speak with the child, we'll source information from the child, the family, and indeed, as I spoke earlier, in relation to the core professionals. The processes that we then intervene under will be guided by that interim protection plan that we sought in the initial stages. The strategy meeting will identify what risks are posed to the child, if any. Can the child go back home? If the child can go back home, then what processes needs to be put in place to enable that to happen? Considerations of the social work department. There's a lot of aspects of our work that we need to consider, in particular when there is allegations of child abuse. The competing rights of the adult and the child are fundamentally at the forefront of our practice all of the time. But like my colleagues have said earlier, what we must remain focused on is that the paramountcy principle is first and foremost. The welfare of the child is first at all times. There's the interagency priorities. We work collaboratively within Garda Síochána and our colleagues in psychology and in CAMS and indeed other professions, but there can be conflicts within that, difficulties that we must overcome. Placing the child at the forefront and ensuring that their welfare is first and foremost must be the priority of everyone, but with that comes challenges. And Gardaí want to protect their criminal investigation, which I fully understand, but we must ensure the welfare and the protection of the child. In my experience as a frontline social worker, team leader, and indeed now a principal social worker, I have been in situations where children have gone through criminal investigations, where they have given evidence in court, and I have seen the impact that that can have on a child. It's our job as the social workers on the ground to ensure that those children are protected as best as possible, to ensure that their welfare comes first and foremost at all times, and with that can have its complications. Policies and procedures. We are guided by our policies and procedures in terms of carrying out our interventions and our practice on a day-to-day basis. We are also guided by case law. One of the major implications for our practice was the bar judgment when that came into play, and how that impacted on our direct work with families and children on the front line. We've recently had a new policy from the National Office responding to children who have been abused or neglected. It's currently under review, but again, it provides us with some structure and guidance around how we carry out our tasks. Fundamentally, within both the bar judgment and the new policy, is fair and just procedures. And I can't emphasise that enough. Fair and just procedures, balanced alongside the welfare and the paramountcy principle with regards to the child. Challenges that we find, I suppose, frontline social work, many challenges, not to mention staffing as probably one of them. Being able to get the resources that we need for families, being able to access the resources that we need for children and young people. We have new social workers coming out of university. And I'm not sure if you can all remember coming out of university and how we were as social workers, all full of, hey, we're going to save the world. And then you come into the front line and you realise it's not that easy. There's lots of challenges, and you're presented with incredibly complex cases, very difficult cases to manage. And as a new social worker coming out from college, they're not equipped to deal with that. They're not equipped to deal with that. So I suppose for us to be able to respond effectively to children who are disclosing child sexual abuse, we need specialists in that area. We need our social workers trained, skilled, to understand not just the impact on the child, but to understand the secondary impact on the family, to carry out effective assessments of need, identify what therapeutic input is required, not just for the child, but indeed for the family. We're also placed with the external pressures that is placed on us via the courts and in Garda Síochána. We also have the scaremongering that's placed upon us by the media. We're constantly nervous about, are we doing this right? What if this happens? What if that happens? Have I thought about this? Have I thought about that? It's not an easy job. So how do we support our children and families? As I mentioned earlier, a comprehensive assessment of need. And that's not assessing the child in isolation. An assessment of need must be assessed, the child's assessment must be in the context of its overall family. Providing the therapeutic resources that not just the child needs, but the family need. Does that child need supports in school? Is there issues with regards to the siblings? What has the impact of this been on the family? If it's intrafamilial, we often turn to a non-abusing parent and ask them to step up and be protective. Ask them to make a choice between their partner and their child. They actually take the time to step back and think about that. Think about that as happening to you, the impact that that would have. Supporting that non-abusing parent to accept what we're presenting to them. The provision of services. Ensuring that we have appropriate services in place for our families and children. The difficulty, I know certainly from our end, that we find is accessing appropriate psychology services, CAM services, and a constant response that we get is the child needs to be in a safe and secure environment. We're caught between a rock and a hard place. It's incredibly difficult. Are there gaps? Absolutely, there's gaps. We have rural areas where there is families and children where there's no resources. There's no access to resources. Families living in poverty, where we can't provide them with the resources and the services and the therapeutic input that they need. And there's most definitely room for development. So opportunities for development. The drivers for change, as you all know, we have moved from the HSE into just the Child and Family Agency. For any of us who have been around on the HSE and who are now under TUSLA, have certainly felt that reform. I most definitely do not work under the same organisation that I did before. TUSLA is constantly changing, we are evolving all the time, and we are creating new policies, new procedures. We're influenced by research, and we'll have some research speakers here later today that help inform the practice and help inform our policies and procedures. There's interagency opportunities for development. As I heard my colleagues speaking earlier on, I'm delighted to hear that there's a strong bond developing between TUSLA and Garda Síochána, and I certainly welcome that from our end in Donegal. I certainly will welcome more opportunities for our social workers to be trained in the Section 61B interviewing. Fundamentally, what we're required to do with our children and young people in the front line, we need that training to do that. So we welcome that opportunity going forward. The way forward, I suppose, safeguarding practice, supported by skilled social work practice, interagency cooperation and processes which match the needs of vulnerable children. That's what we want. That's what we're trying to drive for, and that's what we want to achieve. I think that I have did that inside 10 minutes. So thank you all very much for having patience with me.